So today I have a special guest, somebody who you may be familiar with. It is Isaac Botkin from T.Rex Arms Hall of Fame. So, Isaac, would you like to introduce yourself? Would you like to introduce yourself in another way?
Well, I would say Hall of Fame is a little grandiose. I am definitely one of the guys working at T.Rex Arms, along with a whole bunch of other guys. A really phenomenal team that I'm super proud of, and really proud to be working with. We were talking about that a little bit before the show, but yeah, I do some other stuff here and there. But at this point, the joke is T.Rex has consumed everything, and T.Rex does consume everything. It is a full-time job and then some at the moment. So I can't think of anything else to go into the introduction besides that, honestly.
All right. So, am I supposed to include a witty line about a T-Rex being a carnivore that consumes everything in its way, including your time? It's an ontological T-Rex. All right, cool.
It's certainly going that way.
Well, hopefully it consumes you in a delightful direction. But this, if anyone's gotten past our horrible jokes at this point in time, you know that this is John Lovell at home. Mom, can we have John Lovell? No, we have John Lovell at home. This is as a joke. This is the redacted culture cast. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for your support. You guys support us through you support the channel through redactedllc.com. That's where you find all of our merch, and there's always going to be more stuff to go. But now for the important part of the show. Isaac, I want to definitely start where we just left off, where you had the question. Do you want to frame how we think about this subject by first trying to define the Enlightenment, or set up basically a set of assumptions? So
yeah,
let's start with, we know kind of most people, the idea of the Enlightenment, we're talking about, the so-called Enlightenment as far as Western culture, is sort of I wouldn't say documented, because there is a lot of books on it, but most people know what we're talking about in at least idea. But yeah, kind of like the American Revolution, it's not like the edges on it aren't perfectly solid.
Yes. I would say that there's been a lot of oversimplifications in the last however many centuries it's been. And the American Revolution is a great example of that. Your audience is probably aware of a lot of much deeper American history and deeper knowledge about the founders and reasons for the war for American independence than is, I would say, the norm, the commonly accepted narrative, the sort of common denominator of what comes out of, your average school system. So I think that we all have this rough idea that there are oversimplifications of history which are kind of the right direction, but as soon as you dig deeper, you discover there's either a lot more to the story. Sometimes you discover that it's wildly different, but oftentimes you just discover there's a lot more to the story. And the simplifications are kind of helpful for, small children who need to know that the redcoats were bad. But even the American Revolution, you gotta, it wasn't just blue coats good, red coats bad. There was tremendous ideological conversation amongst the founders as they went into war, during war, and then certainly after war. So to just say all the founders were on the same page, they were better friends than a lot of the Enlightenment guys. I'll say that much.
Okay, so yeah, fair enough. I mean, I have a few of our of the Enlightenment thinkers, whether on the shelf. I do, and from one of the most proud of is my father gave me a fine copy of Baron de Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws, which I still haven't read. And if he is listening, I apologize. But the reason why we're bringing up the Enlightenment as a whole is, and on my end, is that there's a certain, let's just say, rote R-O-T-E nature to how the idea of the Second Amendment is addressed, that sort of ontologically begins in 1776, and it has a hard time building on the history and the objectivity, the history and the objectives and the writing and the philosophy and the belief systems that actually culminated at that time with the founding fathers of America writing the Second Amendment. And while we may spend a lot of time in our postmodern world debating the language and the spirit of the law without even addressing the historical context, the Enlightenment itself frames that idea. And even when we say that, we recognize that the Enlightenment itself isn't very easy to define.
Right. Yeah. Well, like a lot of things, it's easy to oversimplify, but yeah, we're talking about, in the better way, I would say, to describe the Enlightenment, it's usually oversimplified into a whole bunch of guys had the same idea and they were on the same page with each other, and the light switch went on. Enlightenment happened. Your comment, the apple fell on Newton's head, and boom, science. Bible gone. Science here. Enlightenment over. But actually, it's a long period of time over many countries where philosophers and theologians and scientists and others butted heads on issues that they did not agree with in any way, shape, or form. And those arguments and conversations and discussions definitely shaped things. And none of those things came out of a vacuum. So I think that was an excellent point that you made, that what came before utterly directed what came after. And to look at this tiny slice of history, which again, the Enlightenment, not a super tiny slice of history, it is decades and decades. But to look at that relatively small slice of history and say that it exists in a vacuum, it's not how people work. It's not how history works.
No, not at all. I mean, and some of the very classic examples of let me rephrase this. It can be difficult to try to reframe the Enlightenment without just saying, this story, it's false, and this story, it's false, and this story, it's false. Yeah. And suddenly you have a bunch of falsified stories and no actual history to retain it. Or another example of it that we see in modern activism disguised as history, historical studies, would be I think there's a word that they call it, that it's not historicity, but there's a word that's used within academics that refers to framing something as if it was a historical account, but it's just basically a gross misrepresentation of history in order to produce a result by picking and choosing the items represented. And one example of it would be the 1619 Project is a American political document that looks at historical documents and only selects ones that represent its predetermined thesis, while ignoring ones that challenge it. And then it begins with a narrative instead of coming to a conclusion. It's literally the opposite of the scientific method. And so when it comes to historicity, historicism, I think that's the one, or whatever it is. When it comes to the Enlightenment, we generally have this idea that it's a transition from a pre-modern world to a postmodern world, and it travels through modernity is a term that I've heard it referred to. And the difference between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern doesn't have as much to do with its reference to dates on a calendar as into what was the generally believed understanding in regards to metaphysics of reality. And that would ask the question of what is truth? Where is it located? Where does it be found? Pre-modern, truth is located in God or the creation, or it's more like the author of truth comes from God in some form. Modern, truth is found in objective reality, and we can divine it or we can determine it. Postmodern, truth is determined by the self. What I see must be true because we have thrown shade or cast doubt on the idea of objectivity itself. But how does that stack up to how you would define something like the Enlightenment?
Yeah, so I think that is very helpful. That these are schools of thought, and while they aren't universal, there isn't a light switch moment where everybody goes from modern to postmodern. The dominant schools of thought shift to where what is taught in our mainstream universities today is predominantly aligned with a single way of thinking. And mainstream media as well, 1619 Project is a good example of that. And so the current way that we think about the Enlightenment is, particularly as it relates to the American Revolution, we had Christianity, and it was the Dark Ages. It was so dark, and it was just bad for everyone. And so many wars, you guys, the dark Christian ages. And then the apple on Newton's head, suddenly secularism reigns supreme. And out of it comes glorious democracy and freedom and liberty. And the Americans jump on this with both feet, and that's why we get the freedoms that we have today. And there's actually a lot of reasons to go along with this oversimplification, because the Enlightenment is full of people that had tremendous ideas that led to great freedom, and the Enlightenment period is also full of thinkers who totally rejected Christianity and went down the atheist rabbit hole. And if you put those two groups of guys together, and you point at the freedoms that came from Group A, and you point at the secularism of Group B, and you say, voila, the secularism of Group B created the fruits that you see coming out of the works of Group A. And they both fit in the same bucket, which is Enlightenment times. That's how you would come to this common misrepresentation. So I've talked to people who have said, Thomas Hobbes and in his great book Leviathan really influenced the American founders. And it's like, have you read this book? Because the Leviathan is his preposition that we need a gigantic, all-powerful, literal Leviathan state to control every thought, word, and action of the people in order for there to be peace and freedom. And the founders, clearly, if you read any of their works, wanted the opposite of that. So while they were reading Enlightenment era thinkers, they were getting ideas from a wider spectrum of places than just David Hume, Thomas Hobbes, like the New York Times heavy hitters Enlightenment book list, per se.
Yeah, very much so. Like it's when you look at us in our day and age, and when you're formulating an idea or writing a book, and I'm like whether or not you and I have written a book or finished a book, or somebody knows the dark history of my book writing, if there's anything involved in that, we know that like you don't take your influence from a single work, because then how would that be anything other than basically plagiarism? And yet we don't apply that same scrutiny to the past. And that's where you get C.S. Lewis's term chronological snobbery, where we think that like now we're so much smarter than everybody else than that ever came before us, because we have more technical words without having any, like, because we maybe have access to more information, we're just smarter. Whereas like there's a difference between having the access to information and the ability to evaluate it. And that's where I've come to think of how the Enlightenment changed we have terms like zeitgeist, which I think came from Nietzsche. But then you also have Thomas Kuhn, who talked about the structure of scientific revolutions and how throughout history, science hasn't been a progression upwards, but rather this is trendy, then it goes away, and this is trendy, and then it goes away, and this is trendy. And it kind of long-form, long-term meta-narrative trends within the so-called scientific community has changed over time between Newtonian physics, and then you had Newtonian physics gave way to somebody else, and then eventually we got to like Einsteinian physics and relativity, and so it wasn't like, while more information was gained and we did correct certain things, it was not purely a ladder to heaven, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it came at cost. And so the Enlightenment, what we're thinking about the Enlightenment is the increase in rationalism and the support or gain for support. I'll finish the thought. You can hear me, right?
Oh yeah, I can still hear you. Sorry.
Okay, good.
You can edit this part out. I wanted to turn this beeping phone off real quick before.
Okay, no, it's fine. I have one on the floor, and I've been on this show where I'm like sitting talking to a guy, and I pick it up and I like throw it across the room because whatever reason something decides to just because we're human, right? But so I like the Enlightenment idea when it comes to even rights. This is where we get the idea of rights. Kind of was born in a sense from the Enlightenment, at least the language of it. And I think that's where people put it in. So we can say at this point in the conversation that the beginning and the end of the Enlightenment is a little bit foggy. It at least is painted in watercolors. But if you sat down and you looked at the historical timeline and you went into the middle of it, it would be a very solid color where, generally speaking, people kind of talked the same way, were at least in the intellectual circles, they were all kind of on the same page, moving in the same direction, but eventually it flipped.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And we've seen, a predominance of ideas appear suddenly. Like, I don't know when the first time you heard the word gaslighting, but you probably hear it all the time now. But like 10 years ago, I never heard that word being used as a description of trying to fool somebody or pull the wool over their eyes or any of the other different, similes and sayings that we had for that. But now it is ridiculously common. You don't want to call somebody a liar or a deceiver. You want to call them a gaslighter. That is a word that has been packed with meaning and just over the last few years. So this is a phenomenon that we see now where people will pick up a word and imbue it with a bunch of meaning. And then 10 or 15 years later, there will be books that have kind of rolled on this concept. And people will say, well, my goodness, nobody knew about deception before the word gaslighting appeared. And it's like, no. You just go back and read some original documents. Like they were talking about people bamboozling each other. They just hadn't attached gaslighting to it. So people were not too dumb to figure out gaslighting. That they were still literally using gas lights. That's why it wasn't a very good metaphor.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, they still knew how a gaslight functioned, so they're like, well,
it's just not the best analogy here.
Yeah, maybe it's called lying to my face, but fine, right? Or trying to get me to think that I don't like. I don't know. Like I know what gaslighting is when I see it. Is pretty the easy thing. Is refusal to engage with an argument and just trying to cast out on the opponent for no reason other than, oh, well, you just don't know what you're talking about. And it's like, it's a pseudo intellectual version of maybe second order ad hominem. That's all it is. It's just,
And I would guarantee that the very first humans who began to sinfully interact with one another were gaslighting one another, even though the term hadn't been invented. And there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of the ideas that appear in the Enlightenment are not new, and they don't come out of anywhere, but they're just, there are various reasons, cultural reasons, why certain ideas take root or why certain words like zeitgeist suddenly become part of Western philosophical conversation when, 2 years before, it was just a German word that nobody used unless they spoke German.
Very much so, yeah. Or like, and that's exactly the reality with the word paradigm. Is like the idea of the word paradigm shift was basically unused before the 70s when Thomas Kuhn popularized it in his seminal work. So yeah. I mean, we can. So maybe the term the Enlightenment is like just a nice retrospective description of a series of events that may or may not have been as connected or as we want them to be.
Well, I would go further and say, there's in the Enlightenment, you have group A and group B who are trying to achieve exact opposite ends, and modern historians put them in the same bucket and say like, they're the same. The same is kind of true of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is an amazing cultural time period where there are shifts and changes and new discoveries. And what the Renaissance, I personally believe the Renaissance is best described as the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation completely butting heads over massive world-changing issues. And today, historians look back and they're like, it's the Reformation. Or sorry, it's the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, Rembrandt, the Dutch masters, all part of the Renaissance, all part of the same cultural movement. And it's like, no. You have a 30 years war where these people are slaughtering each other because of opposite interpretations of the Bible. And all of the things that both sides have invented, you are now claiming that the Renaissance produced. Like, let's be a little more precise here before we just use a single broad brush to paint everything that's happened before. It would be like if a couple hundred years from now, or the way the New York Times is going, a few years from now, we're going to look back on the 20th century and we're going to call everything that socialism, capitalism, everything that was produced in the 20th century, and we'll just call that the postmodernists made all this. And it's just like, this is the period. Everything that happened in the period that is good came out of the people that we like, and everything bad came out of the people that we don't like. And who knows how they're going to categorize us in that time period.
And at the same time, like, I'm not sure how much I'm concerned. Like, there is the joke, you're not a real person in media until Vice does a hit piece on you. So like, one day I'll be a real boy. Maybe I'll get a plaque made, or I'll like print out the article on the crappiest printer I can with the lines and the bad colors and be like, this is the day I was born, and put it next to my birth certificate. Like but the joke, that joke being aside, before we let's get into the nuts and bolts of the Enlightenment and its relationship to violence, individual liberty, individual responsibility, the rights and relationships aspect. Because, and in order to not segue into there, I remember studying early church history transition into feudalism. And one of the interesting subjects that came up was that we tend to have an oversimplified painting that you had this sort of rise of this Christian-ish empire, kind of, Council of Nicaea, Constantine, the Pope becomes a thing, and then feudalism, where like people kind of the end of the Roman Empire and this dispersal of people trying to figure out how to like secure land and stay alive and grow crops, and when the so-called Dark Ages, which is a term that was actually invented in not the Reformation, but in the Renaissance to try to describe the time before them, basically saying yesterday was bad. That's so 950. They're describing the era before them. They're trying to describe the era before them as a method of differentiation by referring to it as the Dark Ages. And yet what in this whole timeline from, let's just say, 200s AD to 1000 AD, and because the Renaissance really starts boiling around 12 to 13 to 14, and that's 400 years or 300 years of time. We have this entire window of time that's blocked off as being the so-called Dark Ages, which could be considered propaganda, but that's a little snide. And what we completely skip over is that, we know that, or we claim that people didn't know how to read in the church-controlled language or controlled reading, but we don't know how we got there, because what happened is Western society, Western civilization transitioned willingly from a literate to an illiterate society. It was not purely through the oppression of a power, but there was a series of issues that went on where the population and the government basically said, cool, we won't read, you'll let the priest do the reading, we'll just do the thing, and you'll provide security. And that they traded the responsibility of being thinking beings for the security of, both in the so-called spiritual realm of being saved by the priest, and in the government by the king and the feudal system, voluntarily, to some extent, not purely, but voluntarily. And so that was an interesting transition that kind of takes an axe to the tree of this idea that, like, well, you had like the Greeks and then the Romans, and then this evil Catholic Church made everybody illiterate and then controlled everything. And you're like,
I think that the fact that you see that in most civilizations really, I think, illustrates the point that you're making. Like, you see the Greeks rise to great power, and people working hard and building and fighting hard and conquering and thinking hard and developing civilization, and then getting lazy and falling into decadence. And then you see Rome doing exactly the same thing. And so it really should be no surprise when we see other civilizations do exactly the same thing. And it isn't even just Greece, Rome, and then the European powers. You have the Eastern Empire. You have a whole bunch of stuff going on in all of these different places where you really see the same pattern exist that demonstrates that people are very lazy. And so that, I think, is a extremely important human motivation that is often overlooked by historians and often philosophers too. People are extremely lazy, and it's easy to figure this out. You can do this by studying your own self and confirming that it is indeed true.
Yeah, it's indeed true that I might say in my prayer, and I recently picked up Augustine again, not because I'm Catholic, but because I have been like on and off reading some of his work for maybe 6 years.
Oh,
and
I'm a huge fan. Also not a Catholic. He is one of the great theologians. So he's so great that Catholics and Protestants alike are like, he's one of ours.
Exactly, right. And I just, I feel bad because I started reading it like 6 years ago, and then I put it down because of whatever reason. And like the very next page was sort of like his thesis for that whole, one of the most important theses from Confessions, which is and I would pray to God, save me from my sin, but not yet, kind of thing. And he was
yeah.
so right. This idea of like he was frustrated with himself because he would sit there saying, save me from my sin, save me from my what is it? He was talking about his like lust of the flesh, or there's a word that he used that I can't recall right now. But he always included the word at the end, but not yet. And I was hoping, and then he had this line after his own quote was, and I was hoping that he would, instead of curing it, make it more intense before it would go away. He wanted to revel in his sin before he was cured of his sin. Yeah. And so like, yeah, I know that story when it comes to our own life. In any sort of honest inspection, you start realizing that you're not all perfect and holy.
So guys like Augustine and guys like the American founders and guys who built these civilizations before their decline really stand out as kind of exceptions to the rule, because it is such difficult work. You've got to overcome yourself in order to do this work of constructive building and pushing pushing the line up, because entropy is real, moral entropy is real, laziness is real. If you just leave your civilization alone for a while, you come back and it's nothing but people on the couch watching TikTok or worse.
Or worse, yeah. So this, instead of this being an actual segue, let's do this. One of the things that you and I wanted to talk to you about, and the objective and the primary subject of the Redacted Culture Cast is gun culture writ large. And
yes. You can tell that that's where we're going from all the conversation that we've had.
Exactly.
This is where we were headed.
Yeah, because actually St. Augustine invented the flintlock. That's why we call him the August King. None of this is historically true. So the point, so I'm sorry. So there are two ways that I think this interacts with modern gun culture, and one of them is, which is probably where we're going to start, getting into the historicity, the historical record, and the historical, let's just say, the historical life that came out of the historical thought that came out of the Enlightenment, that became what we referred to the Second Amendment, and what informed that idea, and what built that idea up, and then also how this idea applies to modern contemporary gun culture. Because as you're saying, as you were talking about how, we tend to stray towards decadence and laziness, it's easy to look at the modern American gun culture and say, well, we just complain about our rights being tread on, and we complain about our rights, but we very rarely see somebody saying, this is my responsibility, therefore I will follow it through. And while we can find it we can definitely find it when we look for it, it seems to have left the chat in responsibilities, because our experience in gun culture, my experience within gun culture, is anytime I hear somebody talking about responsibility within gun culture writ large that I remember from my past, he might as well be voting for gun control, because we need to be responsible gun owners. And it's not about what the actual responsibility of the individual to his community is. Like, my responsibility of owning a gun extends much further than just not accidentally causing harm to my neighbor. So let's go back to, how did the Enlightenment produce the Second Amendment, and where did we get there? Because there's the Magna Carta, there's the rights of man, there's Locke and Rousseau and all these different thinkers that go from a medieval world, which was feudalism, and that birthed mercantilism, and mercantilism birthed sort of forms of capitalism and nationalism, and we have all of these words that travel through the Enlightenment that come to America being founded, people talking about, at that time, it was very relevant that rights and responsibilities were the same talk. If you talked about one without the other, you're a half intellectual. Yeah. And how did we get there?
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of the ideas in the Second Amendment really predate the Enlightenment, and a lot of the things that were happening in Europe. So one of the things that is fascinating is to look at Europe right after the American Revolution, because you see the French Revolution is an obvious example, but you see a lot of the Enlightenment ideas actually come to fruition in Europe instead of in America. And the fact that the American founders went a slightly different way is kind of validation of the fact that it was good to not be part of the British Empire right before everything that happened in Europe. But this idea that humans have rights, and one of the rights is to protect themselves, their families, and their neighbors, goes way back. And so there are Enlightenment thinkers who recognize this and understand that it is extremely necessary for the flourishing of human beings, human societies. And then there's other Enlightenment thinkers who don't. But it was certainly a thread that carried through free society. And I'm most familiar with British common law and British history because it's written in English, and then before that, mostly English. There are certainly similar laws and trends and thinkers in the past. Pierre Viret is a great French theologian who covered the divine right of resistance. So as this idea of the divine right of kings is floating around, the divine right of resistance is something that is being pushed by a lot of reformers, actually. It's sort of interesting. But the idea that human beings can stop people from murdering them, and then extrapolating that out to the point that human beings can defend, groups of human beings can defend themselves against other groups of human beings, is something that you get. I mean, it's a pretty logical thought experiment, obviously. But the more Christian you see different societies becoming after the fall of the Roman Empire, you start to see more emphasis on this. And you certainly see people trying different things. You have different applications of feudalism, where you have professional standing armies, where you have budgets set aside so that it can be available to hire Italian mercenaries. But in England, you definitely see the armed populace being a really important part of the national defense strategy. And that is something that carries through a lot of cultural changes. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that probably aren't even ideological, they're just practical. Because once you have this system that works, and it works well enough that it's better than alternative expensive systems, even if you don't maintain your ideological discipline to really hang on to this idea and hang on to this martial virtue, if you have enemies that live close enough and you're afraid enough, then everyone just keeps their guns anyway. So a lot of times the turmoil around an area would cause people to develop a strategy where the populace is armed, even though ideologically it's kind of hypocritical. So a good example of this is actually Western Germany during the Cold War. Western Germany knew that they were the first to be invaded. So even though Western Germany was very pro-gun control, they also had companies like H&K making things like the Volks pistol to arm the entire population with. And the Volks pistol is not a very good gun, but it also is kind of fascinating because it is a whole bunch of things that the National Firearms Act in America says are bad. It is a fully automatic pistol with a stock. Like, it is the most horrific thing you can imagine. And Western Germany in the 70s wanted to have enough of these to give every single German citizen, even though they were pro-gun control, because they were more pro not getting completely dominated by the Soviet Union even more. And so a lot of times you see countries and civilizations saying one thing and doing another. But I think that there is a lot of ideological consistency at different times in England and in different times in America. And during America's founding, I think that a lot of these ideas were really came to a head and were put to a test in the 1760s and 1770s. And so people had both that practical application, a great understanding of their own personal responsibility, and then with all these ideological ideas that were fomenting and swirling around during that Enlightenment period to really try to figure out how to get this down on paper so it doesn't get lost, so it is really defended. And personally, I think the Second Amendment is one of those things that is woefully underdescribed. Now, shall not be infringed is very clear, so that should be sufficient. But previous legal documents from Britain go into a lot more detail as to who the militia is, what they're actually required to do, what they're actually required to supply to their sons and servants and neighbors who can't afford proper arms, arms for offense and arms for defense, how often they train, etc. there were Second Amendment-esque rules and laws in different parts of English history that go into way more explicit detail as to what the militia is for, what private weapons ownership is for, and a standard that is not just like, well, you should have a hunting rifle, but it was like, you will have these capabilities, this many arrows, this much armor capacity, and you will buy these things for your son starting at a very young age, and you will train with them on these certain Sundays. So in some ways, I feel like the Second Amendment is actually not as fleshed out as it could be. But again, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It harkens back to all of these things. It has a very rich conversation around it. If you read the letters of the founders, if you read some of the other laws that they passed about militias, you can see that they presuppose all of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we could take a sense of like historical humility from this and recognize that over time things have to be reestablished within culture, and truths have to be relearned. Like there's this idea, like I'm more than likely sure you've heard of the Strassow generational theory, which is like strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. And I always have an issue with this kind of, let's just say, theorizing, because it sort of writes itself as an assumption that it's inevitable, and it also doesn't really, it also doesn't really impose a responsibility on the individual, because what I can do then is I can say, we are approaching hard times, and if I survive through it, I'll be a strong man. In reality, you might be the weak man causing the hard times because you're allowing weaker men to dominate your culture. And I don't mean weak in some sort of, like alpha beta sense. I mean that you're complaining about the collapse of your society while doing literally nothing to change it, even within the small frame of influence that you have, which might just be your family, your home, or your neighborhood, or your community. And so that, like, I think that, that this historical pattern, we can take some optimism from it by saying, well, you know what? Sometimes you just have to till the field. You have to like re-ingrain these values into a community. Before, you use the word necessary. Necessary has one meaning in modal logic and another meaning in colloquial language. In the language of the logician, necessary means there is no possible world where it could not exist. So the question is, are numbers necessary? I think the answer is yes. Like there's no possible world where you can't have the differentiating, because as long as you have two objects, you have a 1 and a 2. You have two things, two different concepts. So it's like, don't think of it as, well, the shape of the 2 and the way that it's spelled, but the idea of there being two separate things is necessary, because in order for one thing to observe the existence of another thing, there must be two things. Therefore, it's necessary. Long-winded conversation. What it turns into, though, is that the idea of the rights of man being tied to some sort of situational need in accordance with their current scenario. The idea of West Germany is excused for being hypocritical because in regards to gun control, because of the need they had with the threat presented. And you see this in ideology all the time, where violence is bad except for when it's for revenge. You see it in film. Violence is bad except for when it's preemptive self-defense. Well, I think you're going to hurt me because you're generically bad. Therefore, if I punch you, you're a Nazi, and we're good.
Yeah, and I actually had a ridiculous thought, but you'll excuse the joke. It's one of these things like, violence is bad unless it's in a Mel Gibson movie. And then Hollywood changed his mind, and it was like, Mel Gibson is bad unless he's in a violent movie.
That's great. That's great. Oh, you could almost say the same thing with like Chris Pratt at this point in time.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, the darling of Hollywood until we found out he believes what now? He wore a Gadsden flag shirt.
Yeah, right. He's the darling because he's so lovable until he's now not lovable. Oh gosh, that's hilarious. Although, and I did get a chance to see his Amazon series that was written by Jack Carr, and it was enjoyable. It's definitely a turn from your casual revenge flick. It's a little bit more, say,
A
personal.
little bit more personal, a little bit more convoluted, I think. More going on and figuring stuff out. I still think the best revenge film, or sorry, best revenge story is The Count of Monte Cristo. I think that's kind of the first. It's like the Godfather of all revenge movies. Well, I'm sure there's plenty of examples, but that's like the Western Mac Daddy of them all.
Well, it's very fortunate that I've both read the book and seen the movie, so I don't have to feel like you're talking down to me, because that would just be out of character. It's my role.
This idea that human rights are necessary and we have to have language to talk about them. I think it is similar to your example about numbers. As soon as you have more than one object, you have to have a way to describe them. And as a Christian, I believe that human beings have a sinful nature. So as soon as you have more than one human being and those sinful natures come into contact with one another, obviously there's got to be some ground rules.
Mm-hmm. So rights as a necessary concept within modal logic would argue that there's no possible world where you don't have rights. There's no way.
Yeah.
Now
and responsibilities, and then they have to be tied together. Like if you have a right not to get punched in the nose, then I have a responsibility to not punch you in the nose.
Yes, it's referred to as obligations in technical writing. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I am obligated. There are positive and negative rights, positive and negative obligations. I am obligated not to rob you, but that does not mean that I'm obligated to pay you money.
Right. Now, if you try to rob me, then my responsibility not to punch you in the nose actually changes, because now I have an obligation to prevent you from robbing me. And that one's a little harder to argue than, for example, self-defense. If murder is a sin and a crime, I really have to stop you from murdering other people. I even have to stop you from murdering me. That is an extreme imperative. And if that is true, then self-defense becomes a really, really important thing for us to enshrine as a human responsibility. If human life is a right, then self-defense is a responsibility. And if then you just carry that on, if self-defense is a responsibility, then the tools that you would use to defend yourself are something that should not be denied you, or that cannot be denied you.
Okay, because you made a statement earlier that if murder is a crime, you have a responsibility to stop that crime. You have, but then you change to murder is the infringement of an individual's right to life or self-determination in another language. And by me attempting murder, you defending yourself are exerting not only your right to life, but you're also doing more, obligating the prevention of my infringement of your right. That can go a dangerous road. But you said it's a rights-based argument. It's not whether or not it's a crime, because crime is jurisdiction. Rights is something else. And we hear the language.
And I absolutely agree. We're going down a dangerous road, to the point where I would say, like, I would just go cut to the chase and say murder is unacceptable and is a sin against God because people are made in his image. Because we could do the pure logic thing and pull out different philosophical textbooks and start with their presuppositions and lay out logical arguments why this and why that, like I started to do. But you can also get all tangled up, especially once you get into postmodernism and words having no meaning anymore. So I actually think that the most fruitful thing to do and the most honest thing to do is cut straight to the chase, go back to the fundamental argument and say, who says, that's kind of the ultimate question. Who says murder is not okay? And rather than do a lot of logical thought, which I think you can argue in the same way you can argue numbers, just be like, God says.
Yeah, well, I think from when we come as a Christian's perspective, that's easy for us to communicate to one another, right? Like I think it's easy for you and I to communicate to each other that in the very idea that you have value at all, that you're not a clump of cells, that you're not just a biological deterrence for me to accomplishing my goal, or you're another object to interact with, that there's something to life that's more valuable than, say, feeling good or the chemical reaction that says to my body that you are good feeling now. because I can produce that with alcohol, but I can also wake up the next day and realize it's not the right answer. And then, and it's like your limit of your morality is basically the limit of your foresight, which is a really odd way of saying it. But, you and I can come to the conclusion together, because you and I share certain beliefs, that human life has value because it was created by God in his own image. And that in itself is a value imbuing proposition. It's a value imbuing event. God, having created man, creates man in his own image, and because they are created in his image, they have value inherent that nothing of the created order can affront without consequence, that consequence being determined by God. However, now when we take this into let's just say a secular position, the secular world does have a greater hill to storm, or a greater challenge with this proposition, because if we begin with, say, naturalism, that there is no inherent meaning in life created by or imbued by a creator, then where is that life found? And that is a hard question to answer. We can definitely get into it, but instead of going there right now, because I think that's more of an argument between a theistic and a non-theistic worldview, it does challenge somebody who doesn't have a theistic position on exactly where they locate the value of a person. And when it comes to legal systems, and when it comes to ethical systems, the idea of a human being having value can probably, in a sort of pseudo-secular experience, begin by maybe a group of assumptions that are taken for their utility, which is that you and I, both being Homo sapiens, share equal value. Because we share equal value, the concept of rights is bound between us as being equal on the idea of value, because we're the same being. You're different than a lizard. I'm different than the gecko in my backyard. Therefore, you and I are not different than each other in the sense that we're both human beings. And because we're both human beings, we are restricted in the actions that we have available to remain in an ethical system in reaction to, in action within one another. And it gets extremely convoluted.
It gets very convoluted, and you find yourself in situations that are really hard to answer, which is like, so you and I are both of us not lizards, so we have some extra value, but so we shouldn't kill each other, but we also, for some reason, can't be trusted to own guns. So another guy who has a special badge, he's the one who will stop us from killing each other. And his argument for why we shouldn't kill each other is that we aren't lizards. And it's like, well, all right. Like we have a huge amount of just extra layers of convoluted, tangled logic to try to figure out, like, well, what is us not being lizards and not being allowed to kill each other? How does that justify a gigantic secular state that now has to read everything that I type into my phone because we're not lizards? Like, how does this scientific secular statism actually put limits on something like a government so that human rights are defended? So
okay,
this is, I think, a bigger, deeper question that ultimately happens when people look for another way of justifying, or another way of explaining, or another way of defining human rights. They usually start with murder. They usually start with the right to life. And then you end up creating something that really, an argument that can only defend that right, and it doesn't defend other rights to properties, because that man with a badge has to take my property to pay for the gun that he will use to stop us from killing each other with, for example.
Yeah, it gets extremely convoluted, and this is where I think we were talking earlier. It can get really easy to be nihilistic about just, say, the quote unquote state of things, right? Nihilistic just being like the abandonment of hope. Let's just say super black pilled as another cultural reference. It could be easy to, and even in some sense, like rampant pessimism can in some effect become masturbatory. Like, it's so bad. The world is so bad out there that I can do nothing but feel good that it's bad. And it's a weird way that some people take. Back to badges, individual responsibilities and rights.
I knew I was setting myself up for that. Go on.
back to back. I mean, yeah, if you want to even get more sarcastic, it's like, why is it that you went to like a 13-week course that means that you're so much better at the thing than me, right? Like, oh, this is a bit of a, you could apply the cop, the badge man being the authority conversation to the same thing of like gun culture and gatekeeping, but I don't really want to go heavy into the gatekeeping talk.
Right.
I want to address it as this idea of like rights and responsibilities and then skill level. So we've kind of come to this point where Enlightenment thinking tied rights to responsibilities. And one example of a right and a responsibility is I have a right to life, which implies a responsibility of you not to infringe on that right. Okay. So that is you have a negative. I have a negative right in the sense that you're not allowed to deprive me of my right to life. Okay.
But you got a responsibility too, because you can't trust me always to, live up to and fully fulfill my responsibilities. So I got a responsibility not to kill you, but you got a responsibility to be ready to stop me because you can't necessarily trust my responsibility fulfilling capability.
Yes, and that comes
just to complicate things.
Well, I mean, and I think that can come down to like a very simplified argument again, or an oversimplified phrase that maybe I would expect similar, you and I having somewhat of a similar upbringing have heard, and that is that, well, people are basically good or people are basically evil. And I think this argument, this phrasing, maybe this framing of humanity and worldviews falls short on one problem in that I have met people who understand or believe that humans are basically evil. When I say basically evil, I mean that we are fundamentally incapable of objective good on our own at all times, which means we are flawed beings. We want evil things from whether or not we control those urges and however that breaks down. But the fundamental statement of evil from a Christian view being, we are affected by sin, both intellectually, our mind is diminished because of sin, our ability to want good is diminished because of sin, and that sin entered because of human choice and free will, whatever. Or you can also come to recognize that human beings do evil things to each other, and they don't need to be instructed to it. You don't need to teach a child to hit another child. You don't need to teach a child to steal. You don't need to teach a child to lie. They do that on their own. You instead need to instruct a child to be good. And as a result, that's where we get this framing of humans are basically evil in that sense. Whereas I have actually never met anyone or encountered anyone who actually believes that humans are basically good. It always can be immediately distilled down to is everyone else is evil, I'm a perfect saint. That's how it always comes down to. Everyone within my ideological camp happens to be perfect saints, and that's where you get a victimhood narrative. That's where you get an oppressor-oppressed narrative. Marxism is a perfect example. That if it only wasn't for those pesky insert race, insert political belief, insert whatever oppressor-oppressed narrative you want to, if it wasn't for those pesky kids, we would live in a utopia.
Yeah. If it wasn't for those people trying to make America great again, America would be great again.
Yeah, sure. Like okay. I got a bridge to sell you. The only way we can make America great is by burning down cities. You're like, maybe you are the bad guys.
So it's a very interesting. It is a very interesting thing, and I think it is important to go back to these fundamental questions. And I will say that kind of on the issue of nihilism and being black-pilled, I'm a very optimistic person. I'm very optimistic about the state of the world when it comes to the spread of the gospel. I'm not necessarily optimistic about any particular country or culture, because when you look back throughout all of history, a lot of times it isn't who you would expect that you see these brave, heroic folks that actually build civilization come out of. It's not always the places that you would expect. If you looked at the early church and you looked at the glory of the Roman Empire and you look at just how amazing the Eastern Empire is after Rome falls, you would never in a million years suspect that this weird little island full of these bizarre blue-painted guys, that's going to actually be a main powerhouse of civilization. That would not be something that you would call in the year 200 or 300 by any means. And so I'm not going to say that I'm optimistic about the future because of country A or country B or whatever, but I am confident that God is on his throne. And if you look over the course of history, you see these ebbing and flowing civilizations, to be sure. You see people succumbing to laziness, but you also see the civilizing power of the gospel actually having an effect, not just a sanctifying effect on the individual, but a sanctifying effect on cultures and nations, to where people that don't believe, or people that aren't necessarily being baptized into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, are nevertheless benefiting from living in a country that is outlawing slavery, for example, that is actually punishing murder, for example. And I am confident that we will continue to see that, even though right now in the 21st century, yeah, it's easy to be nihilistic and to be uncertain about the future. And so I think that is something where also I'm very eager to talk about why I'm optimistic about that. And when I was younger and a little bit more patient, shall we say, I was very eager to talk to secular folks and try to engage with them using their own ideas and using their own logical frameworks and their own worldviews, and try to point out the logical inconsistencies of their own worldviews or positions. And now that I am older, and I wouldn't say I'm grumpier, but I definitely am a little bit less patient. And I definitely feel like the most loving thing for them, because they have limited time, just like I do, is to just go straight to that fundamental question about who says it's actually okay to do this? Who says it's not okay to do that? And tell them why I believe that God is the ultimate transcendent standard that tells us what rights and responsibilities actually are. And then tell them the hope that I have for the future. Not just not just and I don't want to underplay this, but you understand what I'm saying. Not just a salvific hope that there is a way that our souls can be saved for eternity, but also a real practical, tangible hope for the future, that the world that my kids are going to grow up in is not going to be some blasted hellscape that is continually falling into greater and greater disrepair, but that there is actually a hope that God not only saves souls, but he saves people so that they can do practical building constructive work. And if you look over the course of history, you see that happen. And of course, you see the falls, the failures, the collapsing nations, the laziness. But you also see out of these situations tremendously beneficial things coming about that have incredible blessings that affect wider and wider groups of people all the time. So that's part of the reason that I love to read philosophical books and I love to wrangle with the ideas. But a lot of times when I'm having an ideological conversation, and maybe it would be more winsome to follow this guy down his rabbit hole a little further. A lot of times I just want to say, hey man, let's save us both some time. I am a Christian. I believe this, and I believe that reality is not what you believe it is. Perception is not reality. Reality is reality. God says this, and that's where I want to have the conversation now, and not be real pushy about it, but just be like, let's start the conversation here.
Okay, so there's two things that I want to I can directly. I mean, that's okay. Thank you for that explanation and that strength, because I think I see this in academics often. We spend a lot of time trying to, let's just say, extend academic charity where it's not warranted, right? And what I mean by that is that you and I are engaging in a conversation, and I am trying to approach it dishonestly, but you're trying to approach it honestly, and you're extending me the charity of an honest academic conversation, but I'm refusing to. And what I'm doing is I'm subverting your goodwill to be used as a tool against you. And sometimes when it comes to whether it's political or ideological or social conversations, you have to first figure out whether or not the person you're talking to is even worth your time. And that
and that is, the way that you just said that sounds cold and brutal, to just be like, this person isn't worth my time. But I think that it is a very loving thing to do for that person, to be like, this person isn't going to enjoy a fruitless conversation with me for an hour where we get nowhere. I'm doing us both a favor. I'm saving us both some time here. And we'll see what happens.
Or you'll convince, and this is how I think I've seen it play out in other examples, is like, okay, so you encounter, let's just say you're in a study. You're a professor, and you're a professor of logic. And you have a student who has, because of bad faith acting, basically refused to do the job, right? And this is an oversimplified story, but they refuse to pull their weight and do their part of the exchange where the teacher teaches and the student learns. And then the student near the end of the semester is complaining about how, oh, well, I didn't get it, or it was this, that, and the other, and whatever. Well, you fail the student. Because if they don't have, logic is not a, logic or philosophy or real academic study is not something where like whatever goes. The study of history should not be a expression of one's personal, motif on history and my personal truth on history in order to, like impress the professor or whatever. So what the problem is, then the professor has to fail the student, because if he doesn't, the student will have one of two problems. Either one, they will come to understand that neither the professor nor the study is worth engaging with, because neither of them value themselves enough to hold to truth claims. Or two, which is possibly worse, they will think they are something that they are not. They will think they have an understanding of a subject that they don't. And then they will go on with their life thinking they know something. And this is one thing that I've encountered with, as far as like the subversive mentality of, this is the subversive technique that's used by certain ideologies, is that I'll engage with you in a conversation as if we're equals, and I will produce nothing but garbage statements. But as a result, that you and I were talking, now I'm considered smarter because, oh, I was speaking with blah blah blah, right? This is the gotcha guy at a public presentation who, like, I stand up and I start in a debate with somebody who's very accomplished in their field, and now because I'm seen debating with them, supposedly, even though everything I say is nothing but platitudes and garbage, other equally unintellectual people will now think I'm smart because I'm defending their side. And then you have a problem of the academic of going, intellectual charity requires that I understand the legitimacy of your argument in its best possible way. I steelman your argument. But the problem is that you don't fit the moral requirements of being capable of having a conversation on this level. And so therefore, no, you're expelled, you're banned from academics, and you're done here. No consideration whatsoever. And that's a problem that can very quickly become authoritarian and isolationist, and then sort of denies the idea of the academy as a whole. But as time passes, academics and intellectual engagement needs to be able to continue to evolve, to not evolve in whatever, to address problems like dishonest interlocutors and dishonest argumentation and subversive mentality. It's like, we understood that ad hominem means you're not intellectual, you're just a bully. You're not part of the conversation anymore. If you're going to do a Mott and Bailey, you're done. If you're going to do this, you're over. And you need, and maybe if the person shows remorse for their actions, they can be brought back in. But there's none of this, like, there's none of this allowing somebody to. I've used this line, which is taken from Ayn Rand, is I don't debate plumbing with people who don't believe in pipes. Just don't do it.
Well, and I think you made an excellent point as well, where oftentimes we want to play, we want to engage people on their own turf because their turf is the turf that they respect. So we want them to think highly of us and think that we're smart. And I will tell you that a lot of times when I was younger and I was a lot more prideful, that was really my main motivation for trying to engage people's arguments and live inside of their intellectual worldview and debate them there, is because I wanted them to think that I was smart enough to do that. Well, spoiler alert. First of all, I'm not actually smart enough to do that. And second of all, that isn't how you pursue truth, is trying to get people to think more highly of you than they should. And for your younger listeners that maybe haven't picked up on this, if you go into an argument about human rights and gun ownership, and your trump card is God says, like mine is, people will think that you are dumb, and they will say that you are dumb. That will absolutely happen. Like, I guarantee that.
Yeah. So let's pull this back into a conversation about rights and responsibilities. I think one thing that that happens within gun culture is we do spend a lot of time talking about our rights that the government cannot infringe on, or certain things. And where you're talking about optimism, especially when you're talking about the optimism of the gospel, I think we too often forget about what comes after the apocalypse, and we spend all our time preparing for it, which in one sense is good, because I think many of us Christians have been sleeping on the reality that there will come a time of great persecution, and if you abandon the faith at that time, it's not like, oh well, I mean, it was kind of tough, so like whatever, dude. And who cares if it's fair? You know what I mean? So like if you abandon the faith under pressure, there is a question to be said there that it comes to your salvation. You can read the things on the Lapsed is a good one by it's a really old book, like 200 AD. But we forget about that when you could apply this to like the prepper problem, is we spend all our time preparing for whatever pending apocalypse we want to engage in: EMPs, natural disasters, floods, rains, civil wars, Wolverines, whatever. And yet we fail to look at the long game and say, who cares if you survive in a bunker underground because of nuclear war if you didn't have the ability, or you didn't spend the time building a community worth living for? Because I mean, you can be a hermit in the woods in a bunker underground, but you're dead anyway. You might as well go. And so so rather, whether it's in Christianity missing the return of Christ because of the apocalypse, or whether it's in our society, we tend to get really wrapped up in the doom and gloom of gun rights and, the ATF and Joe Biden and whatever you want to talk about, everything being treaded on. It seems like history is moving in one direction within the confines of at least our country. I'm optimistic in that sense, is that I think that all of this can be overturned. I think it can all be completely scrapped and thrown away, but it will not happen, or it will not matter if the American population, especially the gun owner population, if gun culture does not very seriously look internally and as an individual, to yourself, and ask yourself, what are you responsible for and how are you meeting that responsibility? I don't think if we don't come to that conclusion, the rights won't matter. Okay, you're allowed to buy SBRs. Yeah. What does it matter, dude?
Yeah, I think that is a very important one. And again, we kind of covered this in the philosophical section. Rights and responsibilities, I believe, they are linked. You can't really have one without the other. And we could have a philosophical cart before the horse question about which comes first. I do think it is helpful, just for practical thinking purpose, to think of responsibilities coming first and rights coming out of them. I don't know I think that God created all those instantly, but my responsibilities are the things that I need to figure out what they are. And then I need to make sure that I actually fulfill those responsibilities. And so, I think the preppers are a pretty good example of people who we see as missing some responsibilities, or even if we're not thinking that, we've all heard about or seen preppers who are planning to live in a bunker. Everything's going to fall apart, collapse for whatever reason, zombies, whoever, and then they're going to live in a bunker until it all gets rebuilt. And it's like, who's rebuilding it though? Are you not helping with the rebuilding? Are you the only person who sees this coming and you're also not going to help rebuild? You're the only one that's going to have supplies and you refuse to do the rebuilding thing? I think this is a really obvious sort of question to ask. And so one of the things that I am hoping that we do here in the gun community, guns are extremely important because self-defense is extremely important. And guns are just technologically where we are at when it comes to weaponry. But guns are only one set of tools to fulfill one set of responsibilities, of which we have many. And I think that this is something that I really want the younger generation of gun culture dudes to really understand and embrace. And I think that is happening. One of the things that frustrated me a little bit when I was younger, I was homeschooled, and I am extremely, extremely pro homeschooling. And so it kind of frustrated me when I would talk to guys who are like, I'm a no compromise Second Amendment guy. I absolutely refuse to let the government have my guns. Not a single gun from my cold, dead hands, but they can have my kids 8 hours a day for 12 years, and then I'll take some money from the government and send them to another school for 4 years. That's fine. And it's if these responsibilities that you have are so important that you need your firearms to defend them, that you have other responsibilities, you have other tools, you have other things that you must be doing in order to fulfill these larger obligations to your family and the responsibilities that you have to your community. And so hopefully people see beyond that. And I think that they are starting to, sometimes in small ways and other times in bigger ways. The fact that this generation of gun owners is more, I would say, politically active is, I think, a positive thing, even though politics obviously only goes so far. The fact that there is a conversation, even just very recently, the conversation has kind of gone from gun ownership for coolness to gun ownership for personal defense to gun ownership for home defense to CQB and now to like larger infantry skills. I see that as a good trend. Hopefully, we continue to connect those dots back to the responsibilities.
Okay, so let's. I like where you're going with this thing because I've had the same frustration. Now, I was also homeschooled too, and you could make a joke that like the homeschooled children of tomorrow will be the rich landowners of the future, and like the public schooled kids will work in the factory. And I know that's it's a facetious joke, but it's not.
It's a facetious joke, but it's not even. I would say it's hardly even a prediction at this point. I think I may have said this to you for the listeners. Those in the third chair, we met at a conference. When I was a kid and I went to homeschool conferences, all the parents there were low socioeconomic people. They had made significant economic sacrifices to have the mom be at home, or sometimes the dad be at home, to buy curriculum for the kids, to do all this with their own money. They had very little. It was a universal truth of homeschooling conferences in the 90s. But when I go to homeschooling conferences now, or I go to conferences like the one that you and I were at, where other homeschoolers were there, there's just a huge number of business owners. I talked to so many guys at that conference who are like, yeah, so my business has like 90 people and, you know, this is my revenue and this is my profit. And have you found some ministries that you would like to support? Because I'm actually like, you know, I got money that's sort of at a loose end here. Like it's the exact opposite of what their parents went through to get them to that point.
Yeah, sponsor me, please. I'm being facetious,
Yeah.
But the point being said is, yeah, no, that's a big change. Like in the 90s, there was kind of the in our homeschooled world, it's like everyone had a 15-passenger van or some sort of like, you know, conversion van, which also, you know, so like. You know, it wasn't just the large families, and there wasn't ever, but it was pretty common where you would see even my grandparents' generation would almost disown families, their children, if their children would choose to sacrifice economic security or economic ladder climbing for the sake of educating their children themselves. I've seen that happen where grandparents would disown a family, parents would disown their child functionally, sometimes more in more extremes than others, because their child would forego a career in order to, or their child's spouse would forego a career in order to educate the children. And the choice to educate the children wasn't out of this fear that the public school system was ineffective, but it was most often that the families looked at their children and said, I have a responsibility to you, and I'm not going to export that responsibility to somebody else. It wasn't this idea that the government schools, and you could find the tropes and you could complain about it, but at the core they were like, you're my kid. You're my responsibility. I will raise you. I will teach you. I want you to be successful. I want you to know the world for what it is. And I don't want to offload that responsibility to somebody else. And for better or worse, hope it turns out. 12 years of your life, and maybe it turns out. Yeah, absolutely. So that begs the question of the Second Amendment, the idea of the right to bear arms or the right to self-defense is a duty, is almost like a secondary component to the right to defend what? You can protect. You're responsible. Let's just say, you can say that. You could say that in a sense that no one is responsible for my life, technically. I mean, people can take responsibility for it, but that's a convenience. It's not like an ultimate statement. I know Ian Strumbeck says no one is coming to save you. He does Ruination. And then there are other versions of this same line. But then when you look at it yourself, the right to self-defense does not end at your own body. You have a family, most likely. I mean, everyone does, because you at least have parents. And if you're an orphan with no siblings, it's not hard to recognize. You have people.
And the Bible, I think, covers this really well. And there's a lot of, obviously, conversation in the Bible about loving one's neighbor. But I think there are even specific verses, and I should have pulled a couple up to check out. But I think this is in Proverbs 10. It says, if you see someone being led away to slaughter, you save them. Like it is an area of, for lack of a better word, something inside of your sphere, something that you know about, something that you have some level of ability to operate in. Obviously, we are aware of people being killed in Nigeria right now, and we're not going over there. We're talking right here. But I'm sure that neither of us would have that same response of just continuing the conversation. If we knew that people in our community, people right out the window, were being mistreated, we would stop the podcast. And because we believe that responsibility does extend beyond like my own personal self-actualized cellular transport device that I'm in right now. My stimulus response vessel is my only, beginning and end of my rights. There is a community responsibility that exists, and the Bible talks about neighbors kind of vaguely, I think, so that people have fewer loopholes to say like, well, he's 2 houses down. So,
Yeah. I mean, there is, especially in even the military world, like to call somebody a coward is not a light phrase. And the idea of cowardice is not something that outside of media or film or even, social media, let's just say, the idea of like being a coward is a very serious accusation to throw at somebody. And that is, you value your own whatever more than your duty to, you value your own skin more than your duty to your family, your community. I remember when I was a kid, and not fully a kid, so that my father I'm not taken away from my dad by Child Protective Services retroactively. But I remember when I was a kid, I saw the movie Saving Private Ryan, and in the kind of final in the latter parts of the movie, I don't remember the locations other than D-Day, but they're basically setting up an ambush to fight the Germans. And there's the one character, and I forget his name, but he's the coward. And because of his cowardice...
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, this is horrendous. But this is a perfect point. Go on.
Yeah, no, and there's this horrible scene where he's like, because he refused to, like,
go up the stairs.
Somebody else gets stabbed to death. His teammates die. And I remember being a kid and having like great compassion for this guy. I felt really bad for him because he was scared and terrified, and I remember that, and I remember as a kid sort of feeling this certain way of like not understanding why everybody hated him. And when I say a kid, it's whatever the time frame is, right? And I remember
I had a similar response, but I also hated him because he's at the foot of the stairs, armed. And there's a guy upstairs with a knife, go up the stairs. That was more horrific for me as a kid than the D-Day scene. And I forget how old I was when I was seeing that. But yeah, seeing him intervene was more horrific and sticks with me to this day more than the D-Day carnage.
Yeah, and I think as I grew older too, I grew to understand it more. And this is a testimony to time being oftentimes good, hopefully good for people, at least in my case, where by the time I got to the military, it was like if I had somebody like that in my ranks, I would just be done with it. You're out. It doesn't matter. I would do whatever it's necessary to make sure that that person is not somebody I deploy with, or that's not somebody I go with. And it became what started as like, I felt compassion for him, but as I came to mature and understand his response, because it wasn't just his right to stay alive, his responsibility, and he drafting and all this other kind of stuff,
Right.
all that goes out the window when you are there and you could be somebody. And though I don't think there is any scenario where it would be right for a government to prosecute him for not going up the stairs, there is something other than the legal system which says that's a coward. You have no place here. You have no place amongst men.
I agree. I think that's an excellent point. It's a practical argument, but it's a pretty solid practical argument against the draft. And going back to the Bible talks about how one of the reasons that you don't have to go to war is this, and if you are afraid. So that is a fantastic argument against the draft, but it's also a fantastic practical point. Guys who are afraid and may not be able to conquer their fears, perhaps, that doesn't diminish them as a man in other capacities. But boy, you don't need that guy on your squad. That guy does not need to be there for a whole host of reasons. And I think this is a really important one and another phrase that I would use that I kind of come back to is courage is a muscle. You have to exercise it. It isn't something where you just sit around knowing that, well, when the life and death moment comes, that's when my courage will be strong enough. I think that you engage ideally in so many small ways. You become more selfless as you do those necessary things to take care of your own responsibilities, take care of your own kids, wake up in the middle of the night to take care of your kids. You build courage and selflessness in these small ways and faithful in these small ways. And then it is, if you read Band of Brothers and other Ambrose books and other first account books, it is the guys who really demonstrated that level of community responsibility in their private civilian lives that rose to the top and were not only not cowards, but were tremendous leaders of men who put themselves first and took care of their units and actually accomplished great things for the war effort. Those were the guys that rose to the top, the people who had developed those disciplines of taking responsibility and looking out for others, that actually did that. And so we should really be encouraging people to do that in the little ways and not just be like, you know what you really ought to do? You really ought to just focus on yourself and then try out for special forces.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to, this is going to be hopefully not too, I hope this doesn't sound too much like, what's the word that you would use? I hope this doesn't sound too much like flattery, but one of the things that I think culturally T.Rex Arms has done a good job. This is just a compliment. So let it go. Is that you guys have done your company and whether it's you and Lucas or whatever, the whole apparatus of T.Rex Arms has done a good job at, let's just say, bridging the gap between certain communities on one hand, as in like sort of, that you are the spiritual child that came, not child, but you came after the global war on terror and the early parts of the GWAT, when it was just like veterans, everything, and veterans are pouring out of the military and filling all the roles in gun culture, and they're taking all this position. And then you have T.Rex Arms, which is like, well, I don't know, like we don't really have you didn't just go find a veteran instructor and hire him to be your lead guy, and then he's now your generic person, right? So, and as a result, new conversations have come up. Like there is, like I personally get frustrated when I see people who I know are in follow you guys get into a fight with somebody who follows GBRS, because I know those guys, I know you guys, and it's not like you and Cole are having a fight online. It's like it seems like sometimes there's a sub tribe that's built, and it's not always. It's ugly,
right? Yeah. And
the point that I'm saying that comes from this one is we now have you and I have had this conversation about how people within, let's just say, a military environment respond to each other. And the coward is somebody to be shunned. He's somebody to be pushed out, not be a part of it. But that's not the same thing as somebody who now in greater gun culture is, you know, whether you're always a citizen or you're a military veteran or you're a police officer, we tend to like kind of, again, simplify and over categorize each other into, well, he's a veteran and he's a ranger and he was a Marine and he was a SEAL and he was a civilian. He's a Lucas Botkin guy and he's a GBRS guy and and it's like, yeah, we will create structures of trying to understand the social environment because it can't just all be soup. But when it comes to a person who refuses to participate in refuses to be a part of the volunteer military because he's a coward, does that person lose their place within gun culture? Do you think?
Interesting. I guess I would hope that we would build a gun culture that doesn't discard that guy. I mean, he certainly should lose a certain measure of, like, let's say this guy has touted himself as a great and fearless fighter. Well, yeah, he obviously isn't that anymore. But if he has certain skills or abilities, or if he says, and this happens, I'm trying to think of real life examples. This happens a lot in fiction. A guy chickens out in his first battle, and then, unwilling to live with the shame of it, he redeems himself through some great act of valor, and usually dies in the third act. But if a guy, you know, goes into combat, realizes he can't hack it, comes back, becomes an EMT or a volunteer firefighter so that he can put himself in harm's way and build the fortitude to do that, I think that this should be really a kind of a case-by-case thing, and not even case-by-case, person by person, but like, what is this person doing in gun culture? Because there are guys that are here in Tennessee, and I don't want them. I don't want to name them by name, but there are guys here in Tennessee that I know personally who have probably no fame per se, but they are incredibly amazing, solid guys that I would want at my back in essentially any situation. And their place within gun culture is phenomenal. They have done things behind the scenes for different groups, for different industries, for different vendors. And if that guy had a crisis of faith or whatever, you wouldn't actually know about it, but I would know that that guy is still a solid dude that failed because of his current track record. So I really think it's a case-by-case thing. And I really would like gun culture to be again more than it is, so that we rally around something other than just the gun side of things. And a lot of times, the fact that we are so gun centric, I think, shoots us in the foot a lot, because there will be guys that have great content in one area, and it turns out they're a lousy shooter because they spent so much time developing content here or there. I just forgot his name. There was a very important officer in the Revolutionary War who owned a bookstore. I can't remember his name. He was overweight. He'd read all these military books. He was not a man of incredible combat capability, but as a logistician, as a guy who could go out and get stuff done, who knew what was going to be necessary and which missions were important, he was utterly invaluable. But as a fat guy who owned a bookstore, you know, he has no place in the Instagram gun community. And I think that we have the ability to, define ourselves really narrowly so that we personally look good in the narrow category that we've created. And that actually is extremely counterproductive.
Okay, so first of all, with the example of the guy in the Revolutionary War who was the bookstore owner. Okay, I have like two sides to this.
I remember his name.
I wish if you want to Google it, I guess. But the point that I would say is that's an interesting example because he is the exception to the rule. He's not the rule, right? Does that make sense? Like, not every fat bookstore owner is going to be valuable to the Revolutionary War, but this guy happened to be.
Absolutely.
Right?
But the thing was, he became valuable, but he kept being a fat bookstore owner. And so hopefully people recognized his value and weren't just continuing to show shade, throw shade at him and just be like, yeah, you brought the cannons that enabled us to win this battle, and you were the guy that did it. But you still do even lift, bro. Like,
yeah,
I don't
right.
know.
Yeah, no, I definitely get within I get within the context of that conversation. There's a famous, I forgot, I think it might have actually been Gladstone. No, it was John. I think it was actually John Stuart Mill who, oh God, I can't remember who it was. I think it was John Stuart Mill who wrote On Liberty, who was an uneducated person who ended up basically storming the halls of academia with his writing, because he didn't go to like Oxford and he didn't go to all these stuff, but the problem is he was the exception. He's not the rule. Not every person who, not like the character from the Revolutionary War determined his value by his capability, and he subverted expectations. But that doesn't mean that everyone who's a bookstore owner is going to subvert your expectations.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So
it was Henry Knox, by the way, who eventually made general. Yeah.
Good for him.
Can't believe I forgot his name. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Knox, right? So School of Hard Knocks. But you get my point, right? So like, there's a certain humility that you need to recognize as the individual. Like if you are in that position where you have, let's just say, unrecognized potential, it's not everybody's responsibility to recognize your potential before you manifest it. Go manifest it, then they will see it. And then when and there's this other thing that I think that's returning to gun culture as a whole, that I think gun culture, if it does it right, will actually lead American culture. It will lead American culture in this subject. Is we need to figure out a path to redemption. We need to figure out a way that where people who have committed certain things can basically come back. And maybe there are certain doors that are forever closed to you, right? One of them being, you do the whole stolen valor thing. You're never going to be able to open that door unless you are the exception to the rule of being part of like the veteran charity kind of thing, or you're never going to. And that's part of the reality of the game, is that if you break the honor system, if you show yourself as dishonorable within gun culture, it will never accept you again. And the rules that we have on honor are sometimes very obvious and sometimes not. And one of those that is very obvious is stolen valor is a really good example. I had the pleasant opportunity at one point in time of being in the military, knowing a guy who I would define as a coward, which is interesting because it's like he also sort of self-selected himself out of my ecosystem over time. And it's not like a suicide or anything, but it was interesting to see that like once that information started once that knowledge started kind of coming forward, everyone disowned him. Everyone in the entire community disowned him. And it was interesting to see within that world that he was done. But if over time he had somehow redeemed himself, I think that there would have been a door open for him to come back in. And within greater gun culture as a whole, I think we have a hard time trying to figure out these kind of interactions, which is exactly why I wanted to have the conversation with you on this one and about it as like greater gun culture as a whole. Because I think it's so particular.
I do like the idea of gun culture becoming a thing that does lead America, because I think that one of the things that the last couple of years have shown us is that America as a whole has become extremely security focused and safety focused and caution obsessed, to the point where things that have a very low mortality rate have to be avoided at any and all costs. And so I think that it is very likely that the gun culture people have decided that they will take personal protection onto themselves as a personal responsibility. They're not going to ask other people to do it for them. They're not going to demand that other people do it for them. Those are the people who have the I guess the head start is the best word. Those are the people that have the best head start to address some of the bigger shortcomings that we are currently facing. And then hopefully they have the maturity to grow into taking responsibility in other areas so they can address the other shortcomings. And so my hope is that that happens very quickly, partly because there's a lot of shortcomings, but also because by being so focused on guns and being so brittle, it is, I think, very counterproductive. And I think that there should be there should be some non-negotiables as to how, if you're someone who isn't responsible in certain areas, you cannot be a champion of responsibility. I'm going to say something very unpopular, but I've talked to some military guys who are diehard loyalty and commitment and keeping your oath, and they're on wife number 4, and they see no issue with that whatsoever. And I agree with them that there is a little bit of difference in their mind as to what they are swearing to when they are operating these two different spheres. But I really don't think that you get to categorize your oaths in that way, to categorize your commitments and your covenants in that way. And so that's one that people will argue about.
I know that one. Actually, I know that one gets very, very personal very quickly, because
for sure. Because everybody has a buddy who they trust with their lives all day long, who has also cheated in this other area.
There's also
I still see that as an area that we've got to address.
There's also kind of the trope of like the military special operations private contractor super veteran who on paper, no one cares about it. Like, he doesn't have the accolades because he doesn't want the medal, and he's whatever you want to do with that. But there is this trope in like kind of Western, let's just say Western zeitgeist. I'll use it again because I don't want to have another word for it, but that is like the veteran who is like, or he's not even a veteran, he's still in, and he's like the Delta special operator, SEAL, MARSOC, Navy ninja. And you're like, yeah, well, we need to get, McGrath in, and McGrath is like, oh man, my wife left me, and everyone kind of chuckles about it. Or like, there are people in the military who are in that position. And it's an ethical question, because we tend to like not put down, but step aside from that. We tend to make explanations for that issue. Like, and I
think it should be case by case, because obviously there are cases where there's a guy who joined the military first, and then later he gets married, and she decides she can't hack it while he's on deployment. Like, obviously that's a very different situation than a guy who is a habitual cheater, a habitual oath breaker in this respect. Totally different scenarios. And so I think it does need to be case by case, but it still needs to be something that isn't just a cliche or something that we habitually overlook. When we have this conversation. I'm not saying that we gatekeep all the time, but I'm just saying that if we're talking about responsibility and the wider, greater responsibilities, we can't just leave this one off the table because we're not good at it yet. We just need to get good at this one.
Yeah, it's extremely hypocritical and morally dubious to be a person who complains about all them, wives that cheat on their husbands while in the military, but meanwhile you've got like a second family in Uganda or something like that. Like, okay, dude, like I mean, you're sitting there in the team room, complaining about, oh, did you hear about Peterson's wife? Yeah, she cheated on him with some dude from somewhere. Meanwhile, like, you're banging this CSI chick or something like that. Like, okay, dude, like you're not faithful yourself. So like your opinion on the subject is pretty nil, and it might raise suspicion in your faithfulness in other areas. And we could probably turn that into a witch hunt too quickly. And I think there's a certain amount of like, I do have faith in gun culture writ large to recognize that that I think they'd be able to handle that question. There are other questions that also engage in the subject pretty distinctly, and some of them might even pertain to like, here's one. There needs to be a path to redemption for somebody who's had like a negligent discharge. Like, just because you
that's a good example. Yeah.
Right. Like, now I'm not saying that a person's negligent discharge should be excused. I'm not saying that it should be excused, but at some point in time, if you shoot enough and you spend enough time, and the more time you spend practicing and shooting, you're only adding to the likelihood of a negligent discharge. And while you should never make excuses for it, that should not be the end of you as participant in this industry. you might have to pay your dues. You might need to earn some social capital, but it doesn't mean you're like, oh yeah, you're done. Oh, he's over. Oh, he had a negligent discharge. It's like, oh yeah, well, I'm sorry. If I shoot like 30 rounds a year and I'm chuckling that Travis Haley has had a negligent discharge in his life, there's a certain bit of like, okay, dude, okay, dude.
Yeah. And I would say that one of the things that is frustrating, and this is culture wide, not just in the gun industry, is there's a huge amount of gatekeeping from the peanut gallery. Most of the criticism comes from the cheap seats. It isn't actually the thought leaders who are saying to themselves, man, this guy turned out to be a coward and we've got to usher him out. It's the guys, it's the anonymous YouTube accounts that are the ones that are actually raising the hue and cry most of the time. And that is, it's kind of ludicrous to me, but I also think it's kind of funny, but it is interesting that we listen to the peanut gallery a lot in our culture. We are so focused on public opinion that even anonymous YouTube accounts that are probably Russian bots at this point really affect cancel culture in a way that we should just be like, nah, we go to people that we know and we trust, and we're like, hey, I got blind spots. Is this one of them? Because 150 Russian bots say that I can't shoot worth beans. And I'm just curious, and because 150 Russian bots can't be wrong, surely. And then people who have actually proven themselves can be like, no, we actually have some standards, and we actually have enough of a relationship to be honest with one another, and we don't have to listen to the Russian bots all the time. But culturally, not just the gun industry, but culturally, public opinion has become so important. At the same time that social media has made the entire public capable of being in the spotlight, or the entire public capable of talking about any private thing that celebrities are doing. It's a weird thing for sure. And it has ramifications for the gun industry for sure.
Yeah, it's very odd. Are we coming to the end of the time that you have available?
I was sorry, I was just turning off a baby monitor. I forgot it was on because everyone was being so good. But I think we have just a little bit more time, sure. And you can edit this part out or leave it in as you see fit. It's no secret that we have children.
I prefer the humanizing effect of being open about what we do. But if it's
I think that it is. I mean, I think that it is helpful. Hopefully, for people to realize that when we talk about doing this for our kids or that for our kids, that these are not hypothetical future generations. These are like actual little people that my wife and I have a gigantic responsibility towards. And I don't post pictures of them a whole lot because the internet is weird. But I still want that to be a big part of the conversation, and the next generation has to be a large part of the conversation about responsibility. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's kind of put together a longer series of closing thoughts then, like not just like, okay, closing thoughts, you have your 90 seconds and then you stumble through it and I stumble through it or whatever, but rather like, so as we kind of wrap this whole conversation up, and thank you, by the way, for taking the time to, talk with more in depth on these subjects. We've talked a lot about responsibility, individual responsibility to ourselves and to our community, maybe circles of responsibility is a way that could be described. And we've really gone through, a little bit more of what is the foundation and how did we get here? What do you think, if you were to look back at your younger self and you've had, you and T.Rex Arms have had what we could easily say is you've been successful in this culture. What would be, if you're talking to younger people, and I'm a bit younger than you, not a whole hell of a lot, but that are looking at gun culture and they're looking at it honestly and they're trying to figure out how do they find a place and where do they go and what do they do, and what would you recommend looking at yourself that people spend less time on and more time on?
I would say, and this is a complicated one to figure out. I would say that it is really easy to look at gun culture and just see the Instagram and YouTube famous people. And I don't want to diminish those guys at all. Those are the public face of the gun industry, and being the public face has a lot of risks and downsides to it. But gun culture is a lot more than just those guys. And so when you want to be a part of gun culture, or if you even want to be a part of the gun industry, I hope that we have a little bit wider gaze than just the top 5 or top 10 of our favorite gun tubers. And T.Rex is a good example of this. T.Rex is about 85 people that do tremendously hard, good work to make T.Rex successful. And you don't see all 85 of those guys and gals that work there. And I would love to figure out a way, like my kids, where you see what a large part of the gun industry and of gun culture those faceless people actually are. And a lot of them just don't want to be on camera, and I completely understand why. I hope that you understand that a lot of what we're doing at T.Rex has to do with our kids, even though our kids are probably not going to be on camera a whole lot. A lot of what we're doing at T.Rex is for Middle Tennessee community members that you're not going to see on the T.Rex YouTube channel all the time. Hopefully that is something that is really well understood. And when I talk to people who want to be part of the gun industry, a lot of times I talk to people who really do get that. They don't want to be the next gun tuber sensation. They actually want to be one of these behind the scenes guys. The guy I mentioned before, someone who is genuinely an asset across a number of different groups or communities, who is actually the glue kind of holding things together, who is actually an enabler for really good, positive movement. And that I think is the main thing that a lot of us, really need to aspire to be more. And to not be so dazzled by modern 21st century social media, to pin so much of your identity or worth into getting the good comments in the the comment section, I think is really, really important. And, it's a little hypocritical of me saying that, because I am in T.Rex YouTube videos and I am on Instagram occasionally. But I would say that I still think that's a really important thing to figure out and to develop. And if it turns out that you prove your worth, you live up to your responsibilities, you grow, you mature, you are good at teaching, you're an excellent communicator, you will find people to speak to. And the other thing that I've really learned watching the growth of T.Rex, and I've known this for years, but it's really easy to be focused on, for example, the T.Rex YouTube channel and be like, we want a video that has twice as many views as the last one. We would like to get X many subscribers. But at the end of the day, I don't really want to talk to people who aren't listening. If we had 1,000 people really listening and all 1,000 of them watch the video, that would be better than a video that got 1 million non-listeners and 10 listeners. And so this is something that I think all of us need to kind of refocus on in a world where maximum impressions, maximum views, maximum downloads, maximum site hits is so much the driving force. Something that is more focused on actual relationships and discipleship may mean that you are 10 times more effective by speaking into the lives of 20 people than briefly touching 20,000.
When it comes to that subject, I've heard it said, multiple times on multiple different levels that we need to focus in, as a metaphor, on voting locally, right? And it's like, pay attention to your own local government and pay attention to your own community, right? Maybe it's and I've said this before, like, we have an election coming up, and probably one of the most important things that you can do is get to know who are the possible DAs, district attorneys, judges, and whatever in that kind of field. That's going to be
your local sheriff, yeah.
Your local sheriff that's going up for election right now, because you don't want to sleep on the fact that your local judicial system is now staffed with people who hold private vehemence against the gun culture, let's just say, or they're racist or whatever they are, right? You don't want to allow that to be staffed by people who are in your backyard, who are willing to, that in the event that you have any interaction with them, will do damage to you, and forego that for maybe a presidential win or an election, right? And I've heard it said many times from national level speakers that you need to pay attention in your local elections, but I don't always see. And I've even said this myself. It's like, wow, I've said it's important to focus on local elections, but I have no idea who's running right now. I mean, I know
you did just move. To be fair, you're in a new spot.
Well, no, but it has been an issue of like, okay, cool. So I'm starting to learn who the candidates are and figure out their campaigns. And yeah, we did just move, fine, but that excuse does not apply because
not next 2 years.
No, but even where I was at, I wasn't paying attention. When I lived in Minneapolis, it was like for a while I had become nihilistic. Well, people who I don't agree with are going to win, so why should I try? And that eventually faded over time. I eventually was able to get out of it, but like I know that mentality because it's easy for us to say, well, not everyone should be striving to be the YouTube influencer or the gun tuber or the Instagram guy or the celebrity or the Gundy's Awards guy or whatever you want to call it. Not everyone should strive for that. Sure, I'm going to strive for it. You strive for something else. And we can miss that point a little bit. And then on the other side, we can also, I think we can become resentful because of people's success. So, like that's a careful one that we got to be careful about. Like I've seen in my own life when I've done that, where it's like, I knew a guy before he was successful and then he blew up and he got really, he achieved something that was very hard to achieve. And for a hot minute, right after he achieved it, I did not like him. I was angry and frustrated, and thank goodness I was able to mature out of that. But I remember that day. So
yeah,
cool.
I think we've also probably seen guys who achieve success, and the success negatively affects them. And I'll just circle back super quick to your local politics. I think being way more local is helpful. I will say that when I put out a YouTube video, do I pay attention to the views? Yes. Do I see like how quickly you're going? Yes. But because I am interacting with a lot of people here in Centerville and trying to spend a lot of time with my wife and kids, that helps me see the shallowness of those bot comments a little more clearly. The context is there. If you spend the time and the effort to know who your local candidates are and your neighbors, I think that builds so much perspective that it safeguards against a lot of this other stuff. It's real easy for us to be like, well, my friends are the 6 guys that I always see commenting on the top of the Grand Thumb Instagram posts. It's like, well, maybe those are like-minded guys, but you don't know them or where they are. You need to get to know your actual neighbors, and you need to know the actual guys running for sheriff. And if you know and care about your actual neighbors, you will get involved in the local election. Because, yeah, I don't want a bad sheriff hassling me, but I also know like 150 people in this county that should not have a bad sheriff hassling them. So this larger community context, I think, is the way to deal with a lot of these temptations and pulls in different directions. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that is huge.
I'm seeing it as in my own life and how easy it is for me to get wrapped up in, say, like the national level politics, and like, oh, now, I could become a politico and become whatever. But at the same time, when I am depressed, like actually depressed, it's because I have isolated myself from the people who are within my reach and my vicinity that I'm refusing to spend time with. That's when I like, and like, I can tell you, I've been thinking about this kind of recent events, like moving. One of the things about moving is that I'm not immediately around my friend group that I've known for years. So there's a certain element of like context to the timing, but there have been days where like I've never where it's like just the loneliness of being away, even though it may pass in the morning, of like wow, I feel so alone and I don't know where and like it's like mind numbingly crushing. And then the solution is to get out of the house, go meet somebody. It can be somebody as simple as like having a conversation with somebody at the gun shop. If it's cringy, who cares? And like, or like going and doing something with people and trying to get to know somebody, going to church, but like, then the nihilism of the world kind of fades a little bit. It pulls back. You're like, okay, you know what? I'm fine. We'll make it one more day. What can I offer these guys? What can I provide them? What can I do for my community? And then I get to know a little bit more, and I get to know my neighbor, and I get to know. So yeah, I think that another thing that the gun culture overlaps with greater Americana is that young men are alone, and we are young men, or men itself, like we're not even young anymore, can very quickly become isolated and alone, and that is where I think gun culture can lead American culture, because we're at the point now, like, if you think that men spending time with each other and getting to know each other and building their community is a bad thing, I don't care what you think about. I don't care about your politics. I don't care about your ethics or your feminism or whatever it is. I don't care. If you think that men spending time with each other and voluntarily choosing responsibility is a bad thing, or white supremacy or whatever, I don't care. If you think what you think, if you can think, if you eat what you buy, what you care, I don't care. You've removed yourself from the intellectual pool. And so now I want to focus on things that I do have control over, and I do have interaction with, and I do have, influence over, I can talk to. And then in gun culture as a whole, it comes back down to that of like, maybe I need to stop following the meme of identifying myself with my hat or my veteran status or my whatever I did. Just get to know people. Get out.
Yeah, it could very well be that in your zip code there is nobody who loves the same MCX handguard as you. That's a real possibility. But you know what? There's people you can be friends with, and you can grow together as in taking on more community responsibilities. I guarantee you that. I'm saying that to the listeners. I know you know that.
Yeah. Well, I
like
need
the Lancer MCX handguard myself. I think there's a place for carbon fiber. But,
okay,
but go on.
Well, no, I'm saying that because I need to hear it as well. Like, I am not, I am fortunate to be where I'm at, in the fact that I've gotten to know people like you through actually a chance encounter. Really,
actual like meet space, face to face. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Like, okay, hey, I'm here and you're here, and I was there randomly, but yeah. So, well, let's close with that. I would love to have you on in the future, but that also determines on timing. Isaac, thank you for this longer, more thorough conversation about philosophy and enlightenment, and what we consider rights and responsibilities and how we got there. Anything you want to say before we go?
I'm sorry we didn't go down the Mary Shelley rabbit hole when we were in the middle of the Enlightenment, because that was a sweet point to pick up on. But thank you so much for having me on. Thank you so much for letting it be a freewheeling conversation about that rabbit hole, because I think that is really interesting to explore. And I appreciate what you're trying to do with these deeper conversations. And again, just always enjoy talking. And let me know if there's stuff that we can do. I would love to have a deeper conversation about government at some point. Kind of the next logical step after we talk about community responsibility, and it's you and your neighbors. Just like, is there an institution beyond that? Do some of these things that God says require additional institutions? So maybe a future conversation, that would be a fun string to pull on, new rabbit hole to fall into.
Absolutely, because as much as we all love to be libertarians, sometimes libertarians are just a total like, okay, dude, that's a cope. Like, no, they're so. I was snarky about the man with the badge earlier on, but there is a place for magistrates
who have badges, if that's how you culturally want to do the magistrate distinctor. And there's going to be bad guys for magistrates to deal with. And it's not just you and me doing our Mel Gibson movie reenactment to get revenge. There's a better way to do justice. So we'll talk about that sometime.
Well, then this will be part 1, which is philosophical foundations, and part 2 will be exploration into government and its methodology.
It sounds pretty highbrow and highfalutin, but
well, I mean, I did go to school to look down on people, so we're good. We're good there. Where can people find you in case they're?
Oh, sure. Well, T.Rex is on YouTube. T.Rex Arms is pretty easy to search on Instagram. Trex-arms.com is the website. And if you have listened to this podcast, which is now very long, you must like podcasts. We also have a podcast, so you can search the T-Rex Talk podcast on places where podcasts are promulgated. I think that's everything. I think that's all the socials.
Cool, because I did not know that you had a podcast. Now I have one more thing that I have to add to my listening queue.
Yeah, it's a little bit weird. Offline, I'd love to get your take on the weird diversity of that podcast and its topics. But we'll do that another time.
We'll have to do that another time. And then, so as in closing, this is the Redacted Culture Cast, where we, instead of talking about the need for culture, we participate in building it by the sharing of ideas, the encouraging of the brothers and the sisters to carrying on into the future. So there's your patriotic speech real quick. Where's my flag and my eagle? But thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, you know how to support us non-fiscally, whether it's liking or sharing or subscribing. But if you wanted to add to the electricity bill, you can head over to redactedllc.com, pick up some of our merch, and we will be talking to you guys soon. So, Isaac, thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been a pleasure flexing the intellectual muscle with you, and I look forward to our next conversation. So take care.